Okay, welcome to Chapter 1. By now, I hope everyone has actually got a copy of the textbook, because this is going to be required, right? Okay. Also, did you print out the journal questions before watching the videos? That come in really, really handy. Okay, good. So we're ready to start. So, page 2, Introduction to Chapter 1. So let's just talk about the learning objectives of what it is you're supposed to be learning from this chapter. It's about the importance of database in the web and smartphone era. Okay, the nature and characteristics of a database. That's pretty straightforward. And then kind of a general understanding of tables and relationships. We'll get into that in a lot more detail later on. And then the functions of the database management system. It's like, wait, there's two things? A database and a database management system? Yeah, there is. Okay, so on page 3, the importance of a database. So it's fairly obvious that, with PCs everywhere and local area networks, databases became really big. In the old days, you had a mainframe computer where the database was, and you had a dumb terminal that connected. But that's just not the way we do it anymore. Now we have centrally located databases and servers, or perhaps you have databases installed on your PC. With the internet and the web, look, when I go do an Amazon search for something, that's a database, right? I mean, I click in, I want kumquats, and boop, it pops up a search results page with tons and tons of stuff on it. That's all done in a database. So if everyone is using a database, trust me, everyone, every website you've ever heard of, except for, mom and pop shops, they've all using database. Yes, Twitter uses database. Everybody uses database. And then, of course, cell phones. Now, here it's kind of a dichotomy because, the size of a cell phone kind of dictates, how much physical storage it can have. And so, do I really want to copy all the data down to a cell phone and have you run a database operation on the phone? Or do I want to have it just use the network capability? One, that doesn't cost you any connection charges, like there's no data charges, but consumes all your space on your phone. And the other option, of course, is go ahead and consume data resources. Maybe you have an unlimited plan and you don't care. And so you connect to the database over the web. So there's some choices on where the database should reside. And that has kind of sort of changed over time. If storage is a premium, well, then the answer is fairly obvious. But if connectivity is inexpensive or cheap or free, well, then maybe you'd go in the other direction. And then Internet of Things. This is talking about, your smart refrigerator and you hooked up your doorbell camera and, your thermostat and all the smart devices in your house. And yes, they all, in some instances, all use databases. I mean, for example, Android, which is typically a good operating system to have on an Internet of Things kind of a device. It has a built-in version of a database called MySQL. I mean, it's kind of cut down, but it exists and it's there. It's all by default. Okay, here's some database terms. Don't get excited because you know darn well that I'm not going to ask you to define the terms, but you still need to know what we're talking about. So data. So data is, just recorded facts and figures. If I had data about a student, I would know, what your first name is and your last name and your address and your phone number and your major, just facts and figures pertaining to you. A database is a structure that kind of holds this stuff. And structure is kind of an important word here because a database is not just a bucket where you drop stuff. Okay, that's not what it's about. It's a very ordered bucket. There's a slot over here for your name, and that's where it goes. And there's a slot in the bucket for your address, and that's where that goes. I mean, it's very, very precise. So, again, Facebook, Twitter, Amazon, everything is using a database. So let's reverse that. What is not using a database? Well, okay, I'm using Microsoft Word. I'm probably not using a database. I'm using a spreadsheet in Microsoft Excel. I'm probably not using a database. What about email? Is that a database? Yeah. My inbox, my sent box, and all my folders? Yeah, that's in a database somewhere on some server. Okay. All right. You guys got this. Okay, so the definition of information, and information, it's kind of a cool definition. It's doing something useful with data. Because you could have lots and lots of data, but don't know what any of it means. You know, like if you're a retailer and you record tons and tons of data about all the transactions, but you don't really have any useful information until you've gone through and digested it a little bit and figured out, it looks like on Tuesdays people buy this type of hamburger, and on Wednesdays they buy this type of hamburger. Therefore, I need to make some changes in my schedule, that kind of thing. So information, just doing something useful with data. Okay, so I mentioned that practically all commercial websites, certainly any e-commerce website, is using a database. I mean, you don't go to eBay and get a listing of stuff without it going through a database, right? Okay. So all e-commerce websites, particularly, Amazon. So I'm going to go to Amazon. I'm going to hunt for a product here. Okay. And I'm going to go there and I want to buy some kumquats, by gosh. And there we go. I can buy me. So this search results page, it contains a photograph and some description, some links, all that is from a database search. Now, you didn't actually get to see the database. You don't get to play with it. You don't get to directly add in things. Kinda, sorta, at the search. I mean, you could put a lot more things in here. You could say, and, something, something, or something, something. You could actually put in some query type logic at the prompt here. Most people don't, but that's okay. All right. So typically a database is a client server kind of a scenario. And so what we mean by that is you over here in the user column is using, a PC, a smartphone, or whatever, and you're connecting via whatever to maybe like a web server, which is then connected to the database. So there are distinct parts. I mean, the database part on the right-hand side is, basically just a database sitting on some server somewhere, and how you connect to it by what technique is what we're talking about now. So the client could be a web browser or a smartphone app or, a smart speaker kind of, an Internet of Things kind of thing. You could have your smart device talk directly to the internet over some sort of a connection going to some sort of a database. So the database is the server. That's where not the database. This column here, the web server, app server, and app server, those are the servers that are connected to the database. So the human or the PC never skips over and jumps directly to the database. They always go through some sort of a server to be able to get there. Okay? And so the client is typically things like a PC or a browser or a smartphone, those kind of things. The client typically isn't the human. I know it sounds a little weird, but that's the way it works. Okay, so on page 6, they talk about characteristics of a database. So there's a thing called a relational database, and we're going to talk an awful lot about that later on. But what that basically means is when you have a bunch of data, you organize it in such a way that related things are all separated out. In other words, if I have information about students, well, then that's one table about students. And then if I have information about classes that are being offered in a particular semester, well, then that's a separate thing. And so you keep them separate because it just kind of makes sense. Now they're related because a student could have a class and a class can have a student, right? But you don't combine them together. So a relational database is all about building a database so that it stores one thing in a table, but you can go back and later relate them together. Okay, that's a kind of a key thing. So tables, have rows and columns, right? I mean, and there's some funky terms that they throw in. I typically say like row and column because it's kind of familiar, like with Microsoft Excel. That in your brain, just kind of makes sense, right? Rows and columns. So here's, a row of data and a column of data, right? Okay. Well, databases have the same thing, except sometimes they change the vocabulary a little bit. So the columns could be called attributes, or they could be called fields, and the rows could be called an entity. Ooh. Okay, don't get hung up over all these terms, but just trying to make it all point out. So here's an example of a relational database between student and class. So a single student can have multiple classes, and a single class can have multiple students. So clearly there's a relationship here, right? Okay. So this only contains information about students, and this only contains information about classes. You don't mix them together in the same table. That's the whole point. Now let's contrast this. We've been talking about a relational database. So let's contrast that with something that's not a database. Okay, so for example, this might look an awful lot like that, right? I mean, it's still got rows and columns. I mean, this particular example isn't that much different looking. This happens to be a screenshot of something done in Microsoft Access, which we'll get to shortly. But these kind of sort of look the same, but they're not. This is kind of dumb. What happened here is this information for this particular whatever it is, could be a customer, could be a student, whatever it is. There's no controls in here. So for example, could I type a number in a text field, or can I type text into a number field? For example, for state, can I go in here and type in 1, 2, 3? And machine goes, sure, whatever, dude. I'm happy with that. So there's no controls. There's no data checking, right? So I can type numbers in text fields or text fields in numbers. I can have an extra column that, maybe one row just has an extra column. None of the rest of them do, but one of them does. That's kind of funky. I can have duplicate rows without too much trouble. Well, that's not how it works in the database world. So what we're describing, believe it or not, we're actually describing something called a relation. And we're going to be talking about this in great detail. So if I ask you, like on a test question, what's the difference between a database and a spreadsheet? You'd be able to tell me, right? Okay, good. So let's talk about naming convention. So the textbook uses full caps for table names like student and class, okay? But I will tell you right off the bat, when I'm doing demos, I don't do it that way. I just use uppercase first letter. Okay, I don't do the full caps thing. I mean, it's just a naming convention. There's no rhyme or reason to it. Columns begin with a capital letter. Yeah, I do it that way. And so I'll tell you what the rules are, then I'll tell you what the real world rules. The real world rules is, let's make sure we're consistent. If we're going to call something last name, always call it last name. Last with name all crunched together. Be consistent. Consistency is very important. The SQL standard is not case sensitive. So when you type this in, like I want to query against something, and if I typed in student number all in caps or all in lowercase, it will still find student number with a capital S and a capital N. So this is for the benefit of the human, because SQL is not case sensitive. Okay. So for the benefit of the human, and I would always avoid having spaces in column names or table names for that matter. In other words, it's not student space number or last name space, last space name. Now you can use like an underscore if you want, something like that. But most people just cram the two words together with using a capital letter in the middle to kind of separate them out. That's typically the way it's done. Now, does the SQL standard allow you to put spaces in the column names? Yeah, it will. Don't do it. Please, do not do it. It'll drive you nuts. So just remember that. And then avoid keywords. I mean, later on, we're going to be using a select statement. So I don't really want a column name called select, because that would drive the machine insane. It won't be able to figure out what you're talking about. I can't have a column name called table, because table is the name of something. Okay. So in the SQL standard, typically when we start typing on the keyboard, we're going to be typing in strings, like Bob. And when you do that, you typically put that single quotes around the Bob part. Now, Microsoft Access will allow you to use double quotes or single quotes, but I want you to kind of get in the mood of doing single quotes, because it'll be a little bit more universal later on. Okay, we're coming up on the 15-minute mark. You guys know how this works. I'm going to pause this guy, and we're going to pick it up again in just a few.